Good morning, everyone. I don't know where exactly you're based, but thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you also very much for the very kind introduction. So today, as I have this very given topic to talk about COVID-19 and environmental cooperation. So I sort of really wanted to focus this good hour on this very topic of COVID-19 as a wake-up call for stronger environmental cooperation among the 5 countries presented here, but I guess also more broadly at regional and global level. So let's just jump onto the issue here. So I mean, COVID-19 is still ongoing. So I guess everyone in this room, in this Zoom virtual room, has already a very real feeling of what kind of crisis this is. In fact, this is a multifaceted crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has created the worst crisis actually in many parts of the world. You know, the most prominent and I guess the vivid feeling we all have is the economic shock caused by this pandemic that has exposed many of the structural weakness and fault lines exist in our societies. And the most notably one is definitely the health and social protection systems. Also, the digital connectivity as many things have gone online now. The issue of equity and access to the digitalization is another concern. And of course, the issue also exposed here is our relationship with nature, because eventually, and also originally, this COVID pandemic is a zoonotic disease transmitted from animals to humans. So this is definitely, a wake-up call for us all to revisit the way how we interact with nature, and we must learn something from it. So let's just try to look up some of the figures on top of the slides. So which you can hopefully see clearly that let's take a look a little bit of the bigger picture. Like everyone has been knowing enough and heard enough about the COVID-19 pandemic, but actually 60% of existing human infectious diseases are zoonotic. And among that, at least 75% of emerging infectious diseases are humans, and on humans that have an animal origin. And also 80% of agents with potential bioterrorist use are zoonotic pathogens. And basically 5 new human diseases appear every year, and these are also originating from animals. So what I'm trying to say here is that not necessarily and only COVID-19 pandemic, and in fact, many other zoonotic diseases like Ebola, HIV, and influenza are actually the direct result of we humans overexploiting the ecosystems, both nature and natural resources. So this is a very fundamental issue that we must come to realize, and we must be very conscious about, what kinds of decisions, what kinds of course correction we need to see as we're still trying to, in a way, end this current ongoing pandemic, and also to build more resilient and better economies moving forward. So, but let me also point it out here, it is also not like, it is also wrong as if nothing has ever been done on this very issue of, human nature relationship. There has been many ongoing efforts, including both conceptual framework, including like public interventions, trying to make our economic growth more sustainable and compatible with the ecosystem and with climate change. So among many of these conceptual frameworks that indicating the relationship between the health of ecosystems, the health of human, and also the various functions that actually supports a resilient economy and environment, there's very important thing to realize that is the common underlying principle among many of the the research, and that is human beings are actually just an integral of ecosystems that links nature and human societies. And also the value of ecosystem services, which is the benefits we gain from ecosystems, has been significantly undervalued. So this is a very important issue that we come to realize, and we have to do something on this right now. And let me move on to also look at, if you like, the benefit, if any, of this current ongoing crisis. It is correct that we have seen and maybe unexpected consequences from COVID-19 pandemic, that is the reduced CO2 emissions basically at a global level. If you look into the charts, which compares the global emissions and also in terms of country grouping and regional grouping, that you can see the emissions in 2020 in the first basically 10 months has significantly dropped comparing with that of the 2019 level. And that basically covers all sectors, as you can see on the right top of the slides. It ranges from power to transport to industry to residential and aviation, etc. And also you can see the general trajectory of global emission has also come down. So this is something also we're seeing as a consequence of the current pandemic, especially the economic lockdown, which is also pretty much of a very heated debate right now. Like, can we actually continue on this current trend of lowering the global carbon emission, as we all also have heard and hopefully be very aware of the climate crisis that we're dealing with at the same time? This is one of the most recent and also personally, I think, most interesting studies that I've seen since the pandemic. This was publicized on Nature last June. So it's very interesting for us to look into this left side very carefully, because this is actually trying to look back into history. Let me try to walk you through some of the key analysis and salient messages here. So basically, if you try to look into where we are like almost right here at this orange downwards line. So this is like what we're just seeing from the last slide, that the global CO2 emission level has declined. The International Energy Agency estimated that as of end of 2020, we have seen about 8% of global decline of CO2 emissions, and which is actually the largest annual percentage drop of global emissions that the world has ever seen since the Second World War. This is pretty significant. But as we are also trying to recover our economies, I guess the question here, which is really critical for us all to think about, is that as our governments and all sectors are trying to avert a global recession and recovering from the current economic lockdown, the question is, how are we gonna be managing those trillions of dollars that are coming into our economies to stimulate different sectors? It is very important to note that the International Monetary Fund anticipates that the economic recovery by the end of last year, if provided no further large outbreaks of disease like COVID, and if nothing else changes in their modeling, then the emission as of end of 2020 will tick upwards once more once we recover. So this is very important to note, like what kinds of trajectory, what kinds of pathway, going forward that we have. So the choices ahead is the question to be considered here. Basically, there are several different choices and pathways that we can think of. But before talking about that, this study was actually quite interestingly examined the past crisis. So I think there were like some of the 5 similar crises, well, definitely not caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but made similar impacts on our economies. So the first one in the lower part of the chart that you can see was the first oil shock, basically began in the early 1970s, and then covered up right now to the COVID-19 crisis we're in. And the study shows that the way in which government spends stimulus monies actually gives a strong indication, if not dictation, on how global warming will play out. So looking at basically the blue line and then the dotted line, which indicates that as COVID was a shock, and we definitely gonna deviate from the trajectory of global emission pre-COVID. So the choice is that what kinds of recoveries that different governments will choose, design, and enforce. And the question here is also, are we able to seize this as opportunities for green recovery, for better recovery, for more climate resilient and robust recovery? The fact is, if you look into the blue line, the slope of growth of emissions also varies. That shows that basically what the world has experienced over the past 5 major economic shocks since the first oil crisis that I just talked about, 4 of them have actually slowed down the rise of emissions as the economy recovered post the crisis. For example, the Asian financial crisis that occurred in 1998, however, was an exception, because if you look into this blue line, the slope was pretty steep, meaning that actually the post-Asian financial crisis growth actually has pushed for higher emission growth as well. So what does that tell us? So according to this study, that has something to do with that during this period of time, that after the 1998 Asia financial crisis, that the world had seen the phenomenal rise of China that promoted heavy manufacturing and exports, and that has all been primarily fueled by coal. So that's why, as part of the reasons that the global emission level has risen up during that period of time. But quickly enough that we have seen another crisis in 2008, which is the global financial crisis. But then if you look into this blue line and the slope of it after the 2008 global financial crisis, in fact, the emission growth has halved to 1.6% per year over, that 10-year period of time. So, and then the interesting question to ask is then what has made that emission level declined in that 10-year of post 2008 global financial crisis recovery? Also, we have seen that, for example, countries like China played very significant role lowering the slope. So what happened basically during that time, if now we look back, like many countries, not only China, has taken a more like sustainable growth approach, or however you name it, but it was definitely on a track of low carbon transition. So this different growth approach has actually made the curve different. And also up to 15% of the global stimulus that post 2008 global financial crisis actually went into either developing or deploying green technologies. So that has made a real difference in terms of lowering the emission at a global level. So the message is, as said in the study, that shocks are painful, but they are also the political and industrial turning points if the right incentive is put into the place. So in terms of what we need to see here is what kinds of trajectory moving onwards that we need. And we definitely need the one that can bend the emission curve downwards because of the Paris Agreement. I'm sure that everyone has heard about it and learned even quite deeply about it, that we have to stabilize the climate and really go for a raise to the net emissions, as many countries now have committed in terms of carbon neutralities in many parts of the world, in Northeast Asia, in Europe and in the United States, for example. So it is critical that to really reflect at this moment of time that looking at history, it shows that the economies, of course, including its recoveries, actually, it doesn't just bounce back right away to the pre-shock stage. It really takes time. It takes time to see what kinds of policy economic choices the public sectors and private sectors has made over a few years' time. So there's a time lag there. So, so we have to be very cautious about that. And then we also have to be really patient of that if we are on a greener pathway, it might also likely takes a few years' time at least to see really in the bank book, like how has that been helpful in terms of boosting the economy, stimulating the economy recovery, and lowering the emission levels. But again, what I would like to point it out here is now basically, if you look into this tail part, you see the dotted orange line as well as the dotted light blue line. I hope you can see that clear enough. So this is, in this analysis, what it talks about is that the forthcoming recovery. So if, historically, being wise about our future choices, if this recovery can be focusing on either hopefully it's a green recovery, then it can actually make a very contrasting difference in between the two basically extreme choices, which is the orange one represents the dirty recovery scenario and the light blue dotted line represents the green recovery scenario. And they would make some 230 gigaton in terms of carbon emissions entering into the atmosphere by 2050. And what does that mean? That is almost about twice of the potential impact of this current pandemic alone. So we're dealing with in a way, twice of the magnitude of the emissions we'll see by 2050. It all depends on what kinds of stimulates that the government will actually put into the place over now, but then over the next few years of time. So we have to make sure that serious investments goes into decarbonization so that the actual trajectory of global emission post, hopefully we can soon end this current COVID-19 pandemic, will actually bend the emission curve. Now let's move on into some of the other stories and in the backdrop I would like to share with you in this I think is an orientation day for everyone here. What we need is definitely we need to build back and better, and we also need to build our economies towards forward. So it's not just about returning to where we were before the pandemic, but actually to be more progressive because we have multiple crises to be addressed at the same time. In the environment context though, so basically we have seen there are several needs and very urgent needs that the world will need to act upon very swiftly. One is that we need to halt and reverse the biodiversity loss and restore the ecosystem services. As I pointed out in the very beginning, what this pandemic has educated us all, fixing the broken relationship between human and nature. And the other is definitely to align the recovery measures with long-term objectives for reducing the carbon emissions, the GHG emission, as we just talked about in the past slide. And certainly to strengthen resilience to the impacts, especially the impacts of climate change. But also it's very important to understand where we are now in terms of global environment cooperation. In a very general sense, we've also seen a lack of joint environmental action before, during the pandemic. But the fact is, protecting the environment is a joint responsibility, is a whole of a society thing rather than any of us sole responsibility. So these responsibilities pretty heavy lifting, but we need to share it by all the individuals, basically reflect the cost curve in our individual consumption and lifestyle choices. It has to be responded quickly by policymakers at all levels, at the level of global negotiation table, but also very down to the earth, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And also every one of us will have to be jump onto this in order to manage and use the environment better. So we have multiple opportunities in order to achieve that. One is this nature-based solution. So this is has been quite heavily debated at a global level among governments, among different stakeholders, in order to address the biodiversity losses and its rapid restoration, as well at the moment in the global climate negotiations. So we basically see that the nature as extensive system that has been stabilizing our environment, but definitely also supporting the very fundamental economic growth. So if you look into the ecosystem services, looking into the picture, there are mountains, forests, and watersheds, rivers, wetlands, farmlands, cities, and coastal areas. So in this very extensive ecosystems, but in fact, as mentioned earlier, many conceptual framework already pointed out as the rule of the thumb that the human society is just an integral of this very extensive ecosystems, that there lies so many solutions that can actually trigger both environmental benefits as well as economic benefits. Let's take maybe the river and wetlands part as an example, because I think this is definitely a shared ecosystem that by all the the countries and participants presented here. I hope you can see it rather clear on the screen. So one of the possible nature-based solutions related to the river and wetland system is that to restore wetlands, to absorb and filter floodwaters, store carbon, and provide clean water. So that means really by restoring and managing our watersheds, our wetlands, and our rivers in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our provinces, in our states, it will really help with achieving these multiple benefits all at the same time. And not only that, it will really bring tangible economic benefits. For example, the wetland ecosystems provide multiple services worth up to 15 trillion US dollar, including flood protection. It does way better job than a cement pavement in our watersheds in order to prevent the floods, because it just really gives a lot of natural buffer zone like sponges in order to be very in a very resilient but then robust way of dealing with floods. And it definitely provides fisheries in terms of aquaculture, for example, but then also as natural habitats or also artificial habitats. And then also water purification. So that just really, you can just catch that right away, and it needs to be seen more clearly by all of us, by researchers, by individuals, by civil societies, by the public sector, by investors, that protecting and storing and managing the wetlands are actually about generating this very direct economic benefits at the large scale. But then also not only about the nature-based solutions, there are also other like underestimated and also valued systems and services that we need to now really acknowledge way stronger and better. One of them being that it's our practice and our intervention with the forest and land use, basically forest agriculture and the land sector in general. What we need to see and act on is that we need to build stronger individual and institutional capacity among countries, but then actually also among like in a more specific context like forest management and sort of the agriculture community as well, to accelerate the knowledge transfer on the global emissions actually from the land sector or the land use sector. We need to enhance technology transfer and deployment. Part of it is like hardcore technologies, but the other part is really the soft part, like sustainable land management and practice. We need to share this practice globally and quickly so that different part of the society, especially the land involved in the land sector, can know like in our everyday job as we have our role in terms of generating, producing agriculture products or consuming agriculture products, we know what kinds of better and wise choices we can have that can lower the global carbon emissions. We also need to enable the financing coming in and to implement early warning systems do better risk management, and address a lot of the gaps in terms of implementation and upscaling of the current like sustainable or unsustainable land management practice. It's worth to note this the role, for example, of the land sector emissions were contributed by emissions contributed by the land use sectors in in our countries. Taking China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea as an example, you basically see that the blue bars shows the role of the land and including both forestry, land use changes, and agricultural sectors. The emissions from this sector, has a very significant difference just across the three countries. Where you'll see for both China and the Republic of Korea, there's basically net emissions from the land use change forestry sector, because land primarily is and forests is primarily the carbon sink. It absorbs the emissions. But as for Japan, the land sector, it's a net emission contributor for the GHG emissions accounted for Japan. So what we need to see here is that the increase of nature's capacity for carbon offsetting. So basically to increase the carbon sequestration and basically to increase the carbon sink function of the land sector as a whole by managing the ecosystems more consciously as an effort to build a climate resilience. But also we need to reduce the ecological footprints, especially in forestry sector, when it comes to forestry use, for example, for these three countries. These three countries as a group basically imports some close to 20% of the global timber products. And it also accounts about over 50% of tropical timber products consumption in 2018, which means that each of these countries have a very significant role to play, not only domestically but then also globally through the value chain to lower the ecological footprint through their consumptions, especially in the forestry sector. And so just to coming back to this nature-based solution. So we talked about like a perspective basically of recognizing the value and not only just the invisible value, but really making it clearly the economical value widely spoken and understood. So what we're seeing is there's such an integrated system. So that's why environmental cooperation and joint action, it's not only just urgently needed, but it just really provides multiple benefits, not only in the context of climate change per se, not only in the biodiversity context per se, but really as a cross-cutting sort of multiplier for benefits. For example, if you look into the orange bar on the very left end, if we can come up with, for example, these supporting actions to maintain the functionality of our ecosystems, may that be about forestry, may that be about grassland, mangroves, wetland protection. If we can just try to apply this kind of perspective as a cross-cutting and rule of the thumb. So to think about how we can avoid degradation, what can we do to protect, restore, and manage? And to put that into the context of climate change, we need to mitigate the emissions at all levels. And we also need to build up resilience as we need to quickly adapt into forthcoming climate shocks. And then you will basically see that, just by applying that kinds of perspectives and asking ourselves these kinds of questions, we'll be able just to understand a lot better the role of ecosystem services played in the climate context. It's as we already utilized the example of rivers and wetlands, so we can maybe take a look of the role of forests, for example. It really is the most important CO2 storage, including the vegetation. So we're not just talking about virgin forests, we're not just talking about the Amazons, we're actually talking about everywhere. So it's a very strong approach applicable to all the 5 countries that's engaged here. And also it will generate not only the very measurable, tangible economic benefits, but also this climate benefits. You can basically account like the role of carbon storage, the role of carbon sink, and into there are like universal guidelines on how we can do the accounting to measure the CO2 reduction and also the sequestration through the nature-based solutions. And also, we already seen that some of the governments already pick up this kind of concept or approaches as they devise the economic recoveries and stimulus packages. What's presented here on this slide is the case of the European Union of its Green Deal, and also for Korea, the Korean New Deal. Both are quite representative cases of taking this green economic recovery approach to bring transformative changes into not only just in a way reviving economic growth as for immediate recovery from the current COVID pandemic, but really creating long-term economic gains, but then also environmental gains and social benefits in the long run. Just to maybe give you a nutshell that we can look into the Korean case. In the Korean case, that the Korean New Deal has fundamentally two components. One is this digital New Deal. It promotes digital innovation and dynamics basically in different economic sectors. The other strong component in the Korean New Deal is the green, so-called Green New Deal, which aims to accelerate transition towards low carbon and environmentally friendly economy. And the government has designed this as very well integrated packages to increase targeted investments in economic sectors, but then really focusing on the soft skills, the soft capitals, the human resources in order to create long-term sustainable new jobs. And by doing so, it really creates a stronger safety net to strengthen this so-called people-centered, inclusive sort of growth approach. And it's also comes within strong physical investments and also institutional support and investment. And that further I think it also takes a very strong pragmatic approach by specifically looking into sectorial and also specific key projects So some projects are on the digital end and some are on the green environmental end, and some it's lies well in between. So as for the Green New Deal part, some of the key projects developed were thinking of energy, like green energy, green remodeling in terms of building sector, etc., and then also green mobility. Also, this year is a very critical year for the biodiversity because the world government will come to discuss about the so-called post-2020 global biodiversity framework in October this year. In terms of the recovery package developed by the European Union, it actually sort of put the biodiversity strategy right into its core. If you look into, so we haven't got the chance to, but if you look into the European Green New Deal that we basically just skipped for the sake of the time, because I really wanted to leave some time for discussion. So just to give you a very brief idea that how the recovery package developed by the European Commission has really taken this biodiversity, the nature-based solution into its core. It talks about different kinds of targets moving forward. Basically, there are targets related to at least establish 30% of the land in the European Union as protected areas, and similarly also as marine protected areas, and restore degraded ecosystems at lands and in the coastal areas across the whole of Europe. And then more specifically, we also see the very specific targets like forestation or forestation, planting 3 billion trees in the next 10 years, basically, reduce the use and risk of pesticides by 50% by 2030. And also you see the other very tangible actions that are clearly being called for in the European context in terms of a recovery plan that put biodiversity right into the core. And that said, this year is also a big year for climate change. In November, there will be the COP26 for the international climate policies for the UNFCCC process. As part of the Paris Agreement, that the world basically need to develop this long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, and also bring the carbon neutrality goals forward into countries' nationally determined commitments under the global climate regime. So basically, we have already seen that quite rapidly, many countries already designed such kinds of well-integrated policies even before COVID pandemic. But given these are really long-term strategies, these kinds of, for example, in Fiji, the government has designed a low emission development strategy for 2018 to 2050. And in Costa Rica, there's also the National Decarbonization Plan till 2050. So these are the national plan devised as a result of the international processes on climate change, and these kinds of plan as countries recovering or building stronger economies from the current pandemic will also be sort of guiding the stimulus, will be guiding the recovery plans. Otherwise, we'll be ending up, in a very different trajectory than what governments and also citizens had initially planned for. So we talked a little bit about this post-2020 global biodiversity framework. There's lots of words on the screen. So if you just look into this figure here, so the world is basically a 2020 vision, where, as humans will be living in harmony with nature. And this is exactly one of the very harsh lessons we have learned as we're going through this current COVID-19 pandemic. So personally, I remain to be very optimistic about how we can address, how we can work together to deal with this multiple crisis, the COVID pandemic crisis, the global health crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and so many others at the same time. We won't be having the those luxury time nor resources to deal with them separately. We have to really take a very smart and integrated approach to well understand how to design and come up with solutions that can really generate multiple benefits. So a lot of these key ingredients, for example, in a post-2020, currently remains to be a draft global biodiversity framework, could actually be well implemented as for inspirations for some of the other, plans, to be developed to address any of the issues that I just talked about. For example, it's very important to design and implement the support mechanisms with sufficient resources, making sure there's enough capacity to deliver on these goals. There's the knowledge, not only knowledge that already there, but then knowledge to be shared across communities, across countries. We also need to make sure the role of technology can help us, and innovation can help us to accelerate the changes we need to see in the next few years and decades. And as for the Northeast Asia, say, sub-region, one very specific example I would like to talk about here is this, for example, the so-called Northeast Asian Sub-Regional Program for Environmental Cooperation. It's a very long name, NEASPEC for short. So this is a mechanism, and by far the only mechanism, a comprehensive and intergovernmental one, established by the 6 countries. You see the flags here. So China, the 2 Koreas, as we're talking about, I guess maybe you also talk about the Korean Peninsula and what's the future outlook of it. So the 2 Koreans, and then Japan, Mongolia, and the Russian Federation. So these 6 countries almost 30 years ago established this mechanism in order to jointly discuss what kinds of environment, what kinds of cooperation, what kinds of joint actions that they can take in order to address some of the urgent environmental issues arise in the Northeast Asian context. So our office basically has been supporting this mechanism on a daily basis as its secretariat. This mechanism is actually governed through the so-called senior officials meeting. It's basically on an annual basis. These 6 member governments will send their delegation at a senior official level to really sit down or meet up virtually these days to discuss about what kinds of issues are are so important for them to respond and to identify joint responses and to engage different stakeholders. Not only the governments will be working with some kinds of work out some solutions, but engaging with civil society, with communities, and engaging with the researchers, the experts, to really co-design some of the solutions. So I leave the websites here for those who might be more interested in a very tangible example. On this tangible example, can look into is www.neaspec.org. There's plenty of information there on both specific environmental issues, but then also some of the latest developments at both intergovernmental, governmental level, and then also showcases how different parts of the society can come and work together for some of the specific solutions. So with that, I thank you very much, and I would like to take some questions or to have some focused discussions for the next, I don't know how much time we have because we started late. So I'll just give the mic back to the facilitator. Thank you very much.